The envelope was still on the kitchen counter when I got home. I hadn't put it there. It was a new bank card, my bank card, still in the activation sleeve, addressed to me. I'd had it forwarded to my office specifically so no one at the house would see it. But there it was, sitting right next to the fruit bowl like it belonged there. My wife was in the living room. Her son was on the couch. Neither of them said hello. I need to back up a little, because none of this makes sense without the context. And I've learned, the hard way, twice now, that context is everything. I'm 63 years old. I retired early from 28 years in civil engineering, mostly infrastructure contracts out of Columbus. I own my house outright. I have a pension, a solid 401k, and I've always kept my financial life tight and organized. My first wife, Carol, passed away 11 years ago. Cancer, fast and terrible. We'd been married 31 years. After she died, I didn't think I'd ever sit across from someone at a dinner table again and feel anything other than guilty. Then I met my wife at a mutual friend's retirement party. She was warm, funny, and said exactly what she thought. I liked that. I'd spent enough years around people who said one thing and meant another. We dated for 2 years. I met her son. He was 26 at the time, lived about 40 minutes away in an apartment he shared with a roommate. Seemed fine, quiet, a little withdrawn, but I figured that was just him adjusting to the idea of his mother remarrying. We got married in June 3 years ago. Her son moved in with us that September. The way it was explained to me, his roommate had bailed without notice and he couldn't cover the full rent on his own. He'd just changed jobs. The timing was bad. It would only be a couple months. I believed her. He was her son. Of course I believed her. I gave him the guest room, which had its own bathroom. I told him he was welcome to use the kitchen, the laundry, anything he needed. My only ask was that he contribute $600 a month toward utilities and groceries, not rent, just a gesture of participation. That was my word, participation. He never paid it. The first month I let it slide because he said he was waiting on a paycheck to clear. The second month he said he'd had some unexpected car expenses. The transmission, he said, I'd heard that one before from other people in my life and I'd always helped, so I didn't push. By the fourth month, I brought it up quietly with my wife, and she said he was going through something. Could I give him a little more time? It was really hard for him. I gave him more time. That was the first mistake. Not because I shouldn't have been understanding, but because I confused patience with permission. We had a joint account, my wife and I, where I deposited a fixed household amount each month. Groceries, utilities, insurance, whatever came up around the house. I kept my main account separate. That had been my plan from the beginning, and my wife had agreed to it. She had her own income from a part-time bookkeeping job, and she had access to the joint account for household needs. That was the agreement. About 8 months after her son moved in, I started noticing the joint account draining faster than it should. At first, I thought it was inflation. Groceries were genuinely more expensive. Gas, too. I didn't want to be the kind of man who scrutinized every receipt, so I increased the monthly deposit and moved on. Then I got a text alert for a purchase I didn't recognize. A sporting goods store, $340. I didn't say anything right away. I logged into the account online that night and looked back 3 months. What I found took me about an hour to work through because I kept stopping and telling myself I was reading it wrong. There were charges at a gaming store, a clothing retailer I'd never heard of, a tire shop. That one might have been the car, I thought. A restaurant I'd never been to, twice in 1 week. A grocery delivery service that wasn't the one we normally used. And the sporting goods store. None of these had been mentioned to me. I closed the laptop and sat at the kitchen table for a long time. My wife came in around 10 and asked if I was coming to bed. I said I'd be up in a bit. She kissed me on the top of the head and went upstairs. I didn't sleep well that night. I didn't confront anyone. Not yet. I'm an engineer by training. I don't react to a problem until I understand it fully. You build a case first, then you act. Over the next 3 weeks, I printed every statement from the joint account going back to the month her son moved in. I sat at my desk in the basement and went through each one with a yellow highlighter, categorizing the purchases. Some were clearly household, some were clearly not. By the time I was done, I had highlighted just over $4,100 in charges I couldn't account for in any reasonable way. $4,100. Over about 14 months. I didn't yell. I didn't throw the papers across the room. I just sat there looking at the number. Then I started thinking about the card. When we opened the joint account, my wife had asked if her son could have a debit card linked to it. Just for emergencies, she said, in case she wasn't available and something came up around the house. I'd said, okay. I hadn't thought much about it at the time. It seemed reasonable. It wasn't reasonable. It was the door I'd left open. I called my bank on a Tuesday morning from my car, parked in the lot of a hardware store because I didn't want to have the conversation in the house. I told them I wanted to close the joint account entirely and open 2 new accounts, a personal checking and a household account, in my name only. I also wanted to redirect my pension direct deposit to the new personal account. The representative asked if there were any other authorized users on the existing account. There were 2, my wife and her son. I said I wanted both removed and the account closed. She walked me through the process. It took about 20 minutes. I also ordered a new card for the household account and requested it be mailed to my post office box downtown, rather than the house. When I hung up, I sat in that parking lot for probably another 10 minutes, not second-guessing myself, just letting it settle. I want to be clear about something, because I think it matters. I didn't do this out of anger. I'm not a man who makes big decisions when I'm angry. I never have been. What I felt sitting in that car was something closer to clarity. Like when you've been staring at a structural drawing for hours and suddenly the load distribution makes sense and you see exactly where the failure point is. The failure point was mine. I had been so focused on being generous, on not being the difficult stepfather, on proving that I was different from whatever version of me my wife's son had decided I was, that I had handed over financial control of my own household without ever calling it what it was. I'd been paying for a grown man's lifestyle for over a year, and the person I was married to had watched it happen and said nothing. That was the part that sat heavier than the money. I didn't say anything to either of them for 4 days. I went about my routine, made coffee in the morning, watched the news, talked to my wife about normal things, a neighbor's fence, a doctor's appointment I had coming up, whether she wanted to drive out to see her sister in Dayton the following weekend. Her son came and went. He had a truck. I'd co-signed the loan, which was another thing I'd never fully let myself think about, and he'd leave mid-morning and come back in the afternoon. I never knew where he went. I'd stopped asking. On the 5th day, a Thursday, I sat down with my wife at the kitchen table after dinner and showed her the printed statements. I didn't accuse. I just put the papers in front of her and said, I need you to help me understand these. She looked at them for a while. Then she said the charges were household things that had come up. She hadn't thought she needed to run every purchase by me. I asked about the gaming store. She paused. I asked about the clothing retailer. She said her son had needed some work clothes. I said I understood, but that he had made those purchases on a shared account he wasn't supposed to use for personal expenses. She got up from the table. She said I was being controlling. She said I was treating her son like a criminal. She said if this was how I was going to be, she wasn't going to sit there and be interrogated. She went upstairs. I stayed at the table. I collected the papers, squared them up neatly, and put them in the folder I'd brought them in. Then I washed the dinner dishes and went to bed. Her son knocked on the bedroom door around 11 that night. I opened it and he was standing there in the hallway, arms crossed, jaw set. He was 29 years old and he had the look of a man who had been working himself up to something for about an hour. He said he heard we'd had a conversation about money and he thought he deserved to be part of it. I said we could talk in the morning, that it wasn't a good time. He said he wanted to talk now. I said, calmly, that this was my house and we would talk at a time that worked for me, and that time was not 11 o'clock at night. He stared at me for a moment, then he went back down the hall. I closed the door. My wife was lying on her side, facing the wall, pretending to be asleep. The new card arrived at the post office box 9 days later. I picked it up on a Wednesday morning, activated it from the post office parking lot, and went home. That's when I found the envelope on the kitchen counter. My wife must have intercepted the mail forwarding notice that the bank sends as a standard confirmation. Just a small envelope, easy to miss, but she hadn't missed it. I'd been careful, but not careful enough. She was sitting in the armchair by the window. Her son was on the couch. When I came in, they both looked at me in a way that told me they had been talking about this for a while. My wife said, "What did you do with the account?" I set my keys on the counter. I hung up my jacket. I said, "I closed it." Her son said, "So what, you just made a decision like that, without talking to her?" I looked at him for a moment. Then I looked at my wife and said, "I'd like to talk to you privately." He said, "I'm staying." I said, "You're not." He stood up. He was taller than me by a couple inches, and I think he expected that to matter. It didn't. I've been on job sites my whole career. I've had much bigger men try to back me down. I said, "This is a conversation between my wife and me. You can wait in your room, or you can wait outside, but you won't be part of this." He looked at his mother. She didn't say anything. He made a sound that wasn't quite a word and went upstairs. My wife said I had humiliated her, that I'd gone behind her back and cut off access without warning, without discussion, like she was a child. I said I had documentation of over $4,000 in unauthorized charges over 14 months, and that her son had been using a debit card on our shared account for personal purchases that neither of us had ever agreed to. She said I was exaggerating. I put the folder on the coffee table and opened it. She didn't look at it right away. When she did, she was quiet for a while. I told her that I wasn't angry, that I understood things had gotten complicated, that her son was her family and she loved him and she'd wanted to help him, but that what had happened was not helping, it was using. And it had been going on long enough. She said he didn't have anywhere to go. I said that wasn't true. He had a job part-time, but he had one. He was 29 years old. There were apartments in the area that rented for less than what I'd been spending on his lifestyle every month. She said I was being cruel. I said I was being honest, and that I should have been honest about this a year ago. Then I told her what I'd decided. She could stay. I wanted her to stay, that was true, and I meant it, but certain things were going to change. Her son had 60 days to find his own place. I would help with first month's rent if he genuinely needed it. That offer stood, and it was sincere. But the arrangement in this house was ending. The joint account was closed and wasn't reopening. We would have a household account that I managed, and she would have a debit card linked to it for agreed-upon household expenses. I would set up automatic transfers for her personal spending money, but the old arrangement, where access was open and unmonitored, was done. I also told her I was talking to my attorney about the co-signed truck loan and looking at options to remove my name from it. She asked if I was planning to divorce her. I said I wasn't planning anything. I said I wanted our marriage to work, but I also said that I had spent 3 years trying to accommodate a situation that had cost me money, peace, and, if I was being honest, my respect for myself, and I wasn't willing to keep doing that. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I didn't know it had gotten this far." I said, "I know. That's partly on me. I should have said something sooner." Her son did not take the 60 days well. The first week, he barely came out of his room. The second week, he started having conversations with his mother that I could sometimes hear through the ceiling. Not the words, just the tone. Urgent. Pressuring. I recognized it. I'd watched it for 3 years without naming it. By the third week, he came to me directly and said he'd been looking at apartments and everything was too expensive, and he needed more time. I asked what he'd found and what the prices were. He named a couple of places. One was genuinely out of his range. The other wasn't, if he was working consistent hours. I said I understood, and I extended the timeline to 90 days. He said that wasn't good enough. I said that was the offer. He went back upstairs. He moved out on a Saturday in early March, 81 days after our conversation. My wife helped him load boxes into the truck. I stayed out of it. I made coffee and sat in the backyard even though it was cold, because I thought they needed that time without me hovering. When the truck pulled out of the driveway, my wife came and sat next to me on the back porch steps. She had her coat wrapped tight around her. Neither of us said anything for a while. She said, "He'll be okay." I said, "I know he will." She said, "I should have seen how much I was covering for him." I didn't say anything to that. There wasn't anything to say that would have made it land differently, so I just let it sit. After a while, she went inside to make lunch, and I stayed out a little longer. The yard was still winter brown, the old oak in the back corner, bare and gray. I'd planted a second one about 6 years ago, a smaller one on the other side of the yard. It was still young, still getting established. I thought about the version of me from 3 years ago, standing in a backyard at a retirement party, deciding whether to walk over and introduce himself to a woman laughing at something on the other side of the patio. I don't regret that decision. I want to be clear about that, but I also know now that love isn't the same thing as trust, and trust isn't the same thing as openness. And openness without attention isn't generosity. It's just a door you forgot to lock. My wife and I are still married. We see a counselor now, twice a month, something I wouldn't have agreed to even 2 years ago, but that I think is worth the discomfort. We talk about money more directly than we ever did. We talk about her son, about what she was doing when she was covering for him, about what I was doing when I kept quiet. It's not simple, it's not healed, but it's honest in a way it wasn't before, and I'll take honest over comfortable at this point in my life. Her son calls his mother on Sundays. Sometimes I hear her laughing in the other room, and I'm glad she has that. He hasn't called me. That's all right, too. I check my accounts every Monday morning, every single one. I look at every transaction, every pending charge, every balance. Takes about 10 minutes. I don't do it because I don't trust my wife. I do it because I trust myself now, and keeping that trust means not looking away. I spent a lot of my life being the kind of man who avoided difficult conversations because I thought keeping the peace was the same as making it. It's not. Peace you build is different from peace you perform. I know that now. 63 years old, and I'm still figuring things out. I think that's probably fine. I've thought a lot about the word generous since all of this happened. I used it to describe myself for a long time. Generous with my space, generous with my money, generous with my patience. And I believed it. But somewhere along the way, generous stopped being something I chose and started being something I performed, because I was afraid of what would happen if I stopped. That's not generosity. That's just fear with a nicer name. What I did wrong wasn't trusting my wife. Trust in the marriage isn't a mistake. What I did wrong was confusing trust with avoidance. Every time I saw a charge I didn't recognize and told myself it was probably fine. Every time her son missed another month of contribution and I let it go to keep the peace. I wasn't being generous. I was refusing to have a hard conversation because I didn't want to feel like the difficult one. And in doing that, I handed over something that nobody had actually asked me to hand over. I handed over my own judgment. The thing about consequences is they don't wait for you to be ready. The $4,100 didn't appear all at once. It built up the way most problems do, slowly, quietly, in amounts small enough to explain away one at a time. That's how these things work. It's never one big moment you can point to. It's 50 small moments where you chose to look somewhere else. And then one day you look at a printed statement under a basement light and the number stares back at you. What changed me wasn't the money. I want to be honest about that. I've been fortunate. The money was recoverable. What changed me was recognizing that I had spent 3 years shrinking myself in my own home, stepping around a 29-year-old man who didn't pay rent, lowering my voice in my own kitchen, lying awake doing math, because I hadn't been willing to say clearly from the beginning what I needed and what I wouldn't accept. That's a failure of self-respect, and self-respect isn't something you're just born with or without. It's something you practice or you don't. I'd gotten out of the habit. My wife said something to me weeks after her son moved out that I keep coming back to. She said, "I didn't know it had gotten this far," and I believe her. I do. But I also know that things only get that far because somebody lets them. I let them. I was so determined to be the understanding one, the easygoing one, the man who didn't make things difficult, that I made things very difficult for myself and then pretended I hadn't. The counselor we see now asked me once what I would tell a younger version of myself about this whole situation. I thought about it for a while. What I came back to was this: the most important conversations are the ones you keep postponing. And every time you postpone them, you're not preserving peace. You're just borrowing against it. At some point, the loan comes due. I'm 63. I still check my accounts every Monday morning. I still have a folder in my filing cabinet with those printed statements. I don't look at them anymore, but I keep them, not out of anger, as a reminder that paying attention is not the same thing as distrust. It's just what it looks like to take care of what's yours.